I should also point out, for those of you who don't know, I'm also working with Irish Rural Link, and previously I worked with the youth services. In fact, I set up the Midlands Youth Service, and I worked with people with disability, with travellers. So I very much came and do come from what's called the community sector. So hence, Pobble, as you know, was set up by, I think it was Charlie Haughey, God bless him, back in the day when ADM were founded. And I think it's 25 years in existence this year, and really it sort of rebranded to Pobble in the zeros. And at the moment, Pobble manage a budget on last year's accounts of 485 million. I can tell you next year's accounts will show that it is managing over the €500 million. And that's monies dispensed to what's called the wider community. Most of that money, a good 50%, maybe 60%, is definitely going into what's called the childcare area. And the rest is distributed. You'll know some of you will know the terms like SICAP, the Social Inclusion Fund. Some of it is going into they pay the Rural Social Scheme, their wages. So they pay a number of programs for the elderly, for youth cafes, etc. And over the years, as Ivan will be significantly saying, Pobble's role has not alone been to dispense this funding, to manage this funding, but to ensure that this funding is actually spent correctly. And that means Pobble have become quite an institution in terms of rigour. In other words, those of you who do report back to Pobble will know, and some of you have, well, maybe none of you here, but people have bent my ear in no uncertain terms as to what a shower Pobble are, looking for this, looking for that. And the Pobble audit has become almost feared. But Pobble will say back, that's the reality, folks. It's public money. Nobody in the wider public will cry tears for any community sector who is giving out about the famous Pobble audit. So the Pobble audit is there, and it's there for a reason, and that is to ensure that the money, which is public, is spent correctly. I would imagine that for many people, especially who got into the community sector in the 90s, there was a much more idealistic frame about why you were getting involved. You were getting involved to do something, to help somebody, to help a community, to help young people, to help old, there was an ideology about it. And you probably found yourself on a management group, which you thought, fine, I can do that. I don't really want to, but if somebody has to do it. And then you realized that actually the management group needs to be quite skillful. It needs to be quite experienced. And here's the dilemma, folks, that the voluntary sector in joining the dots has to start looking at really seriously. In Ireland, the state depends much more on the voluntary sector to deliver what I would call essential services than nearly any other country. We really do. We just depend on them completely. I mean, even, you could argue, even the hospital system is voluntary in technically. So we actually do, more than any other country, rely on the voluntary sector to deliver. The problem with that is we expect the volunteers, especially those on management committees, to be really skilled. And let's face it, any of you involved in establishing a voluntary management committee, I would advise you really, really very strongly to look for people who have those skills. It's not enough that Johnny or Mary were great with working with people. They're there 5 nights a week. They're there night, noon, and morning. Sure, why wouldn't we put them on the management committee? It could well be. That's the last place they should be. That you actually need sorry, but this is the way it is, cold-hearted, dispassionate, figures people who in some cases don't give a damn about what you're doing on a charitable level, but are making damn sure you're complying with the regulatory structure that is now in place. And sometimes that's what you actually need on the management committee, which seems a bit harsh, but that's the way it's going. In terms of the charities regulation that's now come in, the scandals, you've talked about those this morning, it is a fact that really any voluntary grouping that wants to get into what I call the funding regime, it's a major step up. You can be a kitchen voluntary group for as long as you like, raising your own funds, a couple of €100 there, a couple of pounds sponsor or euro sponsorship, and never go any further. And maybe for many people, that's the way it should be. But once you step that extra step, then it's a different space. FOSS is an interesting organization for one thing. It got a lot of criticism in the last few years and eventually went. But I'll tell you one thing. When FOSS was in its prime, every management committee that ran the famous CE program or the SES, those of you who remember that far back program, all of those committees got real practical on-the-spot training in terms of management. In fact, I did some of it myself, and I was a participant in some of it myself. And I tell you, if you look at the FOSS programs around the country that evolved, very few of them, in fact, I don't think any, caused any problems with the regulatory structure. In fact, you could argue, without going too far, that maybe the FOSS board and the senior group could have done with the same training at times. But I say that in jest, I don't mean a bit of it. My point being that those of us who talk about the voluntary and charity services have got to ask the question, are our services of the right caliber of people in management? And are we doing enough? And is the state doing enough to make sure that the caliber of management is at the level it has to be? Otherwise, we get into the trouble we are. And finally, can I say this? There is another serious question to be asked, and it is about the way we pay our taxes. We do not pay enough tax to have what I call the Swedish or Scandinavian model. We just don't do that. Instead, we pay less and we get our charity sector. Our charity sector is working on the basis that a lot of people, as Ivan just pointed out, are giving of their services for free. So that's what we've settled for. So when we're overly hard on the charity sector, we have to remember we've compromised a bit. We are not doing the Scandinavian thing because we can't afford it, but we're doing the next best thing. And in 90% of that reality, the charity sector and the community and voluntary sector is doing a really good job. I know this because as chair of Hubble, I am in touch with a good deal of the groups, the communities, the beneficiaries of funding. And I can tell you 90%, 95% or even higher are exemplary and really don't get the credit I think they deserve. So I would leave you with that point, that that's the dilemma in joining the DOCS, Chairman.